Welcome everyone to this wonderful evening that we've got planned. It's the second lecture this academic year in the Ronald and Valerie Sugar Distinguished Speaker Series. And our speaker today is Henry Samueli, who every one of you has heard of. I'm particularly thrilled to have this event here in Engineering 6. Now, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look around. This is an absolutely beautiful building. This is the first big event that we're having in this auditorium. And so I'm very, very thrilled that this is the event that we're going to have here. We have a beautiful program tonight. As you know, this is an endowed lecture series. The series has been endowed by Ronald and Valerie Sugar. And Ron Sugar is sitting right there at the back. Stand up and take a bow. And I will tell you that I count this as one of the big successes that we've actually had, because we've had this lecture series for about a year now. This is the second year running. And every time we've ever done this, we've run this to packed houses. I mean, there's so much demand, so much excitement about all the speakers that we've brought in. And I'm sure we'll see that again tonight. Right? It might interest you to know that Ron Sugar was actually Henry's boss in TRW. I just found this out about 5 minutes ago. So there's a certain, irony to it, I guess. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about Henry Samueli. Tonight's speaker is Henry Samueli, and it's a name you all recognize. Henry is a pioneer in broadband communications, a globally respected leader in the technology sector, a philanthropist, and a Bruin through and through. And I know after we're done with our conversation tonight, you will have every reason to be as proud of him as I am. Henry co-founded Broadcom Corporation in 1991. He currently serves as CTO of Broadcom Limited, a world leader in semiconductors for wired and wireless communications. As CTO, he drives the vision of the company's R&D activities and its long-term technology strategy. Many of the major leaps in communication technologies over the last 20 or 30 years have Broadcom's imprints on them: fast internet connections, digital cables, smartphones, and more. In fact, whenever you send or receive something on your phone or your computer, at some point in its internet journey, the data will probably have been processed by a Broadcom chip. And that's absolutely remarkable if you think about it. It's really mind-boggling. As you can imagine, Henry's had many, many distinguished honors over his amazing career. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. This is the highest honor that can be accorded to an engineer, and this is highly deserving. He's just been inducted into the National Academy of Inventors. We just had an event for our professors this afternoon, and so that's another honor. He is a fellow of IEEE and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the Marconi Society Prize and Fellowship, and here at UCLA, he received the Alumni Association's Edward A. Dixon Alumnus of the Year Award and the UCLA Medal. So I won't tell you a lot more about his beginnings. We'll talk about that when we have our conversation here. But I will tell you that Henry's received all his degrees from UCLA, bachelor's, master's, Ph.D., and so he is absolutely one of us through and through. So I'm so very glad to have you here tonight, Henry. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing for our school, and I want to bring you up here for our conversation.
Thank you, Dean Murphy. Pleasure to be here.
All right. So let's get started. So I don't know if you guys know this. Can you hear me all right in the back? Yeah. So I don't know if you know this, but Henry Samueli is still a professor in our school. He is a professor of electrical and computer engineering in our school. And so I am his boss, actually. Right? Yeah. Now, every year I I look through people's resumes and their achievements so that I can give them an annual raise. And so I do that for Henry as well. And so every year I look at him and say, well, what classes has he taught? 0. How many students has he graduated? 0. How much money has he brought in? 0. And so I give him a 0% raise, right? So as of now,
on top of my 0 base salary.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So this conversation is in the nature of an annual review conducted in public, right? So the whole point of this is to figure out what Henry Samueli has been doing with his time, right? So I'll maybe give him a little raise this year. So jokes aside, let's get started at the beginning. I know a little bit about your family background. I know that your parents were, immigrants from Poland, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about your family, where you grew up?
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, I'm actually a first-generation American. My parents were both born in Poland and fortunately lived through the Nazi Holocaust and emigrated after the war to the U.S. in 1950 and ended up in Buffalo, New York, and that's where I was born. I was born in Buffalo, New York. So I grew up in a very modest middle-class lifestyle. I mean, my parents pretty much came here with nothing. And when I was 10 years old, the family moved to Los Angeles. And I lived in West Hollywood. I went to Bancroft Junior High School, went to Fairfax High School, and then I decided to apply to university. And UCLA was really the only school I considered applying to. My parents couldn't afford to send me to a private school. It was out of the question, so I didn't even think about even considering USC. For a good reason other than money, but anyway. No, but I could, certainly going away to school would be out of the question. So because UCLA was a local university, had a great reputation, and was cheap, unfortunately today maybe not as cheap as back then. When I was a student, I started in 1971, tuition was $200 a quarter. So my parents could afford to pay for my tuition. So I lived at home and commuted to school and earned all my degrees, as you can see here, at UCLA. So that's kind of how I started out. Now I ended up here in Los Angeles since the age of 10.
So was either of your parents a techie? I mean, what drove you to engineering? I mean, I can tell you what drove me to engineering, and you and I are of roughly the same vintage. For me, it was the moon landing, right? I remember as a child, my mother woke me up at 4 a.m. to listen to the radio, to listen about the moon landing. And it just completely blew me away, and it determined, my future. Mm-hmm. Was that something that worked?
Sure. No, certainly childhood experiences mean a lot. And neither of my parents were engineers or even in the science fields. So I was always a good student. I liked math and did well in school. But in junior high school, I took in 7th grade an electric shop class. And we were supposed to be building a little kind of a crystal radio, a single crystal where you wrap wire around literally an empty toilet roll to create an inductor. I didn't, it was too simple for me. I didn't really want to do it. So I asked the teacher if I could build a Heathkit radio that I had seen in a catalog, which was it's like Radio Shack. It doesn't exist anymore. It was like an AM/FM shortwave radio. It had 5 vacuum tubes, and it looked really interesting, sophisticated. So I asked him if instead I could build that as a course project. Originally he said no. He says, boy, I wouldn't even give that to my high school seniors, let alone a 7th grader. But I kept going back and back. Please, I promise I'll do it well, work hard at it. So he let me do it. So I did it. I bought this kit. Every night at home, I'd sit on the carpet with a soldering iron, following the directions, solder wire A to point A to B, and so forth. and worked the entire semester, plugged it in at the end of the semester, brought it into class, plugged it in, and sound came out. And I was just, that hit me right there. It was like the moon landing for you. The fact that this thing, that a pile of parts that I knew nothing about, that I could put together, solder wires together, and sound comes out magically from this thing, hooked me. And from that point on, I knew I was going to become an electrical engineer because I made it my mission in life to figure out how that thing worked. And I became a communications engineer and build radios, and that's what I do for a living. But it all started from a 7th grade project that I had.
And so you came to UCLA, didn't consider any other schools, and so I'm kind of curious, right? So you would have been what, a high school? You came to UCLA in 71?
71 I started.
71, and and I know that we're living in tumultuous times. There's a lot going on, but that time would have been tumultuous too, right? So the Vietnam War ended in 1975. You graduated in 1975. Nixon resigned in 1974. Johnson stepped down in 1969. So that all of this would have happened around the time you were in high school,
right,
and an undergraduate. I'm really curious about what UCLA was like. I know UC Berkeley was burning down. What was UCLA like? Yeah, it's still burning, and
My wife Susan went to UC Berkeley and went through all of that, literally burning buildings and so forth. So she was a radical. She didn't burn down the buildings, no, but she lived through that era, and certainly I did at UCLA. And it was interesting because I was a conservative kid, an engineer, nerd kind of a kid. So I pretty much ignored everything. There were speeches on campus, and I would just walk by them and go to get lunch. That would be it. But so I was aware of all it, but I was so consumed with studying to be an engineer and just loved the classes I was taking that all that stuff just went over my head. And I just focused on take my classes and do as well as I can and become an engineer. And interesting, because of the times back then, engineering was not a popular profession. It's not like today where everybody wants to be an engineer or a computer scientist. Back then, engineers were driving taxi cabs. It was very difficult times for engineers in those days. So, my pursuit of engineering was not because it was going to be a lucrative field that I thought about. It was just because I loved it. I just wanted to fulfill my mission in life of figuring out how that Heathkit radio worked. So I studied and kind of let everything else go over my head.
You're absolutely right, because engineering went through a real downturn, right? So Sputnik kicked off a whole lot of interest in engineering, and that went on for quite a while. And then all of this stuff with, campus radicalism and so on actually painted engineering as the bad guys. Scientists and engineers were not the good guys. And so there was this real drop-off, and now there's another, there's picking up. So was that true for most of engineering, that they really just sort of chugged right along and worked really hard at it? And was that the culture?
It absolutely was the culture of the students in the school. Yeah.
Is that the culture now, more or less? Yeah.
I think that, with information so readily available, it's different now, because it's hard to avoid getting sucked into all this controversy and talking to your friends and attending meetings, lectures, whatever. So just the availability of information creates a different environment today than it did back when I was a student.
So were you a good student?
Yes. No, I was always...
You care to share your GPA?
No, it was good. I think undergraduate was like 3.8, and graduate it was almost 4.0. No, I was a good student. I loved school. I loved taking math classes in high school and all that. And it's just, I was blessed to be a good student, and I worked hard at it. I always did my homework and studied hard and got good grades.
Were there classes that you liked particularly?
Yes, certainly because I wanted to be an electrical engineer, I took lots of circuits classes and electronics classes. But what I ended up ultimately studying for my Ph.D. is a field called digital signal processing, which when I was an undergraduate, was a brand new field. It didn't exist. In fact, the very first course was taught by Alan Wilson. Where's Alan? I know he's here somewhere. There he is. Alan Wilson is my Ph.D. advisor. And also, I took many classes from Professor Wilson. In fact, he joined the faculty, I think, in 1973 when I was a junior. And I took the very first class that he taught here as a professor 45 years ago, I guess, in basic circuit theory. So when this new class was created in digital signal processing, I was fascinated by it. I didn't know anything about it, but I decided to enroll. I took as many classes as I could possibly take because I was just fascinated by all of them. So I took the digital signal processing class and fell in love with it. I'm a perfectionist type of person. I just like everything to be exact and perfect. And the beauty about digital signal processing is it's exact. You know exactly what the computations are. You know the resolution, number of bits, etc. So everything is very predictable, and it just fit well with my personality. Even though I loved analog circuits, analog is an imprecise science. There's a lot of variations. Things drift and change and so forth, are unpredictable. Where with digital signal processing, everything is very predictable. So for some reason, I just fell in love because my personality was amenable to it, and that's what field I pursued and ultimately earned my Ph.D. in digital signal processing under Professor Wilson.
Yeah, and you guys should know that both of them were inducted into the NAI this last round. So that's really interesting that both PhD advisor and the advisee are both members of the National Academy of Inventors. So did you do anything outside of the classroom? Did you have any fun or?
I love to play basketball, so I would always go to the men's gym back then. They didn't have what's it called, the Collins building with the new basketball court. So there was the men's gym in Pauley Pavilion when it was open for basketball. So I played basketball a lot. So I tried to stay in shape. I loved basketball. And other than that, not a lot. There weren't a lot of clubs like there are now. It's amazing how many different organizations there are. There was the IEEE, and I was a member of the IEEE. But not too many organizations back then. Tau Beta Pi I was a member of. So there weren't a lot of outside activities that I did. I really mostly just focused on my studies and basketball and having weight training and exercising, just trying to stay fit for my educational studies, to be well-rounded there at least.
Yeah, but you did mention that you were there during the golden era of basketball.
Yeah, attending basketball. Even though I played it, I was very fortunate in the 70s, early 70s. UCLA was going through this unbelievable era, the wooden era, where you had Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It was known as Lou Alcindor at the time, Bill Walton. You had all these superstars of the NBA, ultimately, who were students here, and UCLA won 10 national championships in that era. They had an 88-game winning streak when I was an undergraduate. In fact, I think as an undergraduate, I don't remember them losing a basketball game. They were that good. So it was really a great time to be a sports fan at UCLA, probably the best time in the history of the university. And I just really enjoyed attending games whenever I could, because you had to literally wait in line in front of Pauley Pavilion for 2 nights to get a ticket. The student section was impossible to get a ticket for. So it's fun times.
So I looked up your PhD thesis. You got your PhD in 1980, and the title of your thesis is Non-Periodic Forced Overflow Oscillations in Digital Filters. Now, I understand the individual words, but I don't know what they mean strung together. So what was this about? I mean, what was the...
It was actually a very theoretical dissertation, almost more applied math than electrical engineering. And it derived a lot from prior work that Professor Wilson had done. and just studying nonlinear effects in circuits. He had done a lot of work in analog circuits as well as digital circuits, digital filters. So he suggested the topic to me. I investigated it and pursued it as a PhD dissertation. And it was very mathematical, basically involving nonlinear equations that had to be solved. So I pursued that, finished the PhD. But interestingly enough, when I went into industry and even when I came back to be a professor here, I changed the work that I was doing in far more practical nature. At TRW, under the leadership of Ron Sugar here tonight as well, TRW built military communication systems, satellite communication systems, radio communication systems. So that's what I learned to do in industry, and building very practical things, real circuits, getting your hands dirty, literally soldering wires and looking at oscilloscope traces, etc., versus my PhD dissertation, which was sitting in the math library looking up equations and how to solve them. But the fact that your study as a PhD may be different than what you pursue as a career, it's fine. I mean, it's the skills you learn as a PhD student are the most important. How to do the research, how to attend conferences, present your research results. Presentation skills are probably one of the most important things that you can have as an engineer, especially if you want to start a company. Presentation skills are the most important thing because you have to present to investors, you have to present to customers, partners, to convince them that your technology is good and worth buying. So being a good presenter is critical, and you gain a lot of that knowledge as a graduate student presenting your research to not only your fellow students but out in the real world with conferences. So the generic skills you acquire, even though I changed fields when I went to work, were extraordinarily valuable to me. And but ultimately my passion lied in the practical aspects of building radio communication systems, which I learned at TRW first. I'm working on military satellite and communications projects. And then ultimately, when I came back to UCLA to be a professor, I worked at TRW for 5 years after my PhD, which I received in 1980. So from 80 to 85, I was an engineer at TRW. Some of the most exciting work I've ever done in my career there. I mean, working on military communication systems, they were the most advanced communication systems in the world. I learned so much. So when I came back to be a professor, I could use that knowledge base and apply that to a research program here to develop chips to implement a lot of these complex algorithms that were being implemented in racks of hardware 6 feet high at TRW. I started looking at, can I apply the digital signal processing and VLSI knowledge that I had to build chips to implement those complex communications algorithms, and that launched the research program at UCLA, which ultimately flowed into Broadcom, which I guess we'll talk about shortly.
So what made you come back to be a professor? You just want to make a lot less money, or I mean, okay.
Well, that's the moral of the story. Don't pursue the dollars because you don't know when that's going to happen. I never sought to found a company. I thought when I got my first job at TRW working in Redondo Beach, I thought I would spend the rest of my career as an engineer at TRW. Great job, exciting, loved it. But then the opportunity to become a professor here. First, it came as an invitation to teach classes part-time in the evening or afternoons. I accepted that, so I came in from TRW and taught some part-time classes here just to get exposed to teaching. Loved it, really enjoyed it. But then in 1985, it was offered a full-time tenure-track assistant professorship. And that was a difficult decision to make because I really did have to take a substantial cut in pay, about 1/3 reduction in pay. And at the same time, my wife left her job. She was working for IBM in a very good job. And she left the job to be at home full-time with our kids. We had our first children at the time. And so we lost her entire salary and 1/3 of my salary for me to come back here to be a professor. But the opportunity to come to UCLA to be a faculty member was just too good to turn down. So I talked to her about it. She supported it fully, which I'm eternally grateful for. And we did it. And scrape by, but we did it.
Yeah. So what was that like? I mean, did you like the life of a professor, you know, writing proposals and collecting rejects and working towards tenure? I mean,
the hit rate was pretty high back
oh,
then.
in those days.
Okay. But you're right, writing proposals is a challenge, but I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I think there was a little reception earlier before the meeting, and Alan Wilson pointed out how he's surprised that professors actually get paid because they do what they love. They would do this for free, which I often said to myself too as I was a professor, this is a job I would do for free because it is so enjoyable, even though it is extraordinarily hard work. I mean, I don't know that I've worked as hard. Well, actually, in the early days of Broadcom, I worked even harder. But being a professor is really hard work. You know, teaching classes, doing research, writing proposals. But it's just an energetic environment. Being at a university with young, brilliant students, it's just so energizing and invigorating. So I loved it, absolutely loved it.
Do you like teaching?
Loved teaching. Actually, that was one of my favorite parts of being a professor, was teaching. And I was good at it, got very good ratings from the students, and really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think teaching is a lot of fun. It's, you know, one of the most satisfying things you can do in any given day because the feedback is immediate and, you know, it just feels so good. So you kicked off Broadcom in 1991, which was a scant 6 years into your academic career. So what were you thinking? I mean, were you thinking you'd do both, or you're gonna? What was in your mind when all this happened, or even how did it happen?
Right. I'll tell you the story of how it evolved. As I said, I took the knowledge base that I had gained working 5 years at TRW on military broadband communication systems and brought that back to create the research program here in the same general area of chips for broadband communication systems. And again, had no idea of that I'd ever start a company. Didn't even think about starting a company. Entrepreneurship wasn't like it is today, where it's talked about so much and there are classes on it and everybody hears about it. Back then, when you went to school as an engineer and graduated, you went to work for a large company like a TRW, Hughes Aircraft. You know, Southern California was full of military defense contractors, Lockheed and Northrop, et cetera. So that's what most graduates did. They went to work for those companies. You didn't think about starting a company. And I didn't think about that when I was a professor doing research. I was just doing what I loved to do and doing the research on these interesting broadband communications chips and publishing papers and going to conferences, presenting our results. Never filed for a patent, actually, which is kind of interesting because, again, I never thought about commercializing it. I just figured my job is to publish and put it in the public domain and for the betterment of society. Did that. But then we started getting all these inquiries from engineers from industry who attended the conferences where we presented these papers. And they called me up, sent me emails, and said, you know, this stuff is really interesting. We would love to have these chips in our products. Have you ever thought about commercializing some of these chips? You know, in the beginning, I sort of ignored it. But when enough of these emails came to pass, we finally, Henry Nicholas and I, who was my first Ph.D. student, decided, you know, maybe it's time to get serious and start a company and commercialize these chips and put them in real products, real applications. So we did it, and did it in 1991. Literally just the two of us started out, literally in his garage in Redondo Beach. And he was still working part-time at TRW, and he was working on his Ph.D. part-time at, or really full-time and full-time. There's no part-time when you're an engineer. Everything you do is full-time. So he's a full-time engineer at TRW, a full-time Ph.D. student at UCLA. So, but we decided that it was time to try to commercialize this technology, and we founded the company and started literally with nothing. 2 people. We each wrote a check for $5,000, put it in the account to be able to rent an office, and then scrounged around and got some contracts from companies to build some of these chips. So they were funded by companies who wanted the technology. So we didn't even have to go out for venture capital investment. We were able to get our customers to pay for the technology that we created for them, and that launched the company.
How fast did you take off? I mean, were you doubling every year, or
pretty much?
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much double. It was an exponential growth. It really was fast, and it's because the thirst for this technology was so great, and that's where luck comes into it. I mean, it wasn't some grand plans that I had some great vision, and most ultra successful entrepreneurs have pretty much the same story. There's a lot of luck involved because it's hard to envision 10 years into the future where this technology is going to be. We worked on the technology because it was something. Henry Nicholas also was from TRW. He worked there full time. So we had been working on this technology in industry, and it was interesting. We loved it. It was fascinating. So we thought, you know, advancing it at the university would be a good thing to do. So that's why we did it. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened that there was this enormous thirst. The internet had been created here at UCLA by Professor Leonard Kleinrock, really the birthplace of the internet in 1969. And at that time, the way you accessed the internet, it was through a telephone line modem, which operated at tens of kilobits per second, ultra slow compared to today's standards. But that was state of the art back then. So there was this huge thirst for getting to the internet faster and faster. And that's where this opportunity came from, where companies came to us and said, we need to build a cable modem where you can send, you know, tens of megabits per second, not tens of kilobits per second, down a cable TV network to be able to do broadband internet access. Now, we didn't think of that application. They needed it for their, you know, they had products that they were trying to develop. So it was their idea, but they came to us for the core technology of how to build, you know, a 30 megabit modem over a cable network. So we had the core technology, but they had the application for us. But as it turns out, it's an enormous application. And that's how companies become ultra successful, is that when the market that you're developing the technology for is gigantic and everybody wants it, you take off very rapidly. And it was literally exponential, doubling almost every year because of that. But it was digital cable modem technology that launched the company to be the ultra success it was. But it was literally a pull, not a push. We didn't push the technology out there. It was pulled out of us at the university because the demand was so great in the industry for a fast digital modem for consumer applications.
Did you have competition? Were there others playing the same game?
No.
No, that's surprising.
No,
I mean,
because the technology was so new. The only people doing broadband communications at that time were the military, TRW, Hughes. They were building these broadband networks for satellite networks and radios for soldiers in the field, etc. They were the only ones talking about multi-megabit modems, or gigabit modems even. The commercial world, it was all about voice band modem. Bell Labs was doing research on doing 56 kilobit voice band modems. That was the state of the art. So nobody was looking at this from a commercial application perspective. So we really were the first ones to try to apply this know-how from the military that we had to applications in the commercial world. So literally we had no competition. We were at least 2 years ahead of anybody. Of course, the minute we showed the technology out there, everybody jumped on the bandwagon, tried to catch up, but we stayed ahead for years and years, and still to today. So once you have a 2-year lead on your competition, as long as you keep investing in the technology, you can maintain a significant lead, and we did, and that's why we were able to start the company without any patents, because there was nobody to sue. We had no competition, so we didn't need patents. Eventually, we obviously had to file patents, and today, you know, Broadcom has 20,000 patents. But in the early days, our time to market advantage was what gave us the lead. It wasn't patent protection.
But it's still a very long way from a technology idea to going public, which you did in 1998. And this year is going to be the 20th anniversary of your going public.
Yes.
So that's another big landmark. Now, 20 years is not a lot of years for where Broadcom's gotten to, right? I mean, it's actually pretty brief. So tell me about that transition. Now, you were a professor, you were two guys in a garage, and now you've got this, huge company. When you went public, I believe you had 320
Right.
employees. 36
Relatively small.
Yeah, relatively small
Perspective.
still.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
what
we're
was,
still a startup even when we went public.
yeah, yeah.
And that was our mentality. Both Henry Nicholas and I were engineers, and we ran the company like a startup, and it just focused entirely on the technology. The business came, and it's just because the market was so strong that the revenue came to us. It's not like we had to work hard at it. We just had to deliver the technology. As long as you delivered the technology and it worked, people were scrambling to buy it. So we were very fortunate in that sense that we didn't have to have the business sophistication that you might need to develop a market and create the sales force and marketing teams. We were just 100% engineering driven to execute on the technology, and the market was there. So it's fortunate. It's an unusual story. It's not a typical case of a startup. But we did bring in the necessary people and expertise. You need legal help, you need finance help, you need HR help, IT support. So you hire all the experts you need to bring into the company. I think that's the main part that the founders have to do properly is recruit the right people. But you don't have to know how to do it all yourself. In fact, neither Henry Nicholas, or myself literally ever took a management class, ever took an entrepreneurship class. Zero, none. It was all seat of the pants, just common sense. You do the right things from a common sense perspective, and if there's something you don't know, bring in an expert to solve that problem for you. So I don't have to be an accounting expert or finance expert. You just bring in the right people who can do those things for you, and that's how you build your infrastructure in the company. But it was an interesting transition, and eventually we had to grow up and become a mature company with much more of a focus on building the right infrastructure to support thousands of employees. But that took time, and then we ultimately brought in outside professional CEOs who knew how to manage mid to large size companies that we didn't have that expertise to do.
No, but did your engineering brain help you in this? Was that an advantage in pulling all this together and so on?
Being a logical thinker, there's no substitute for that. You can take all the MBA classes you want. An engineer who thinks clear and logical will out-execute any MBA, because it's not about you can open up a book and learn the things you need to learn there. But having the analytical, logical thinking, problem-solving skills that an engineer has, there's no substitute for that.
Yeah, not to mention the habit of really hard work, which I think
right.
Students actually do pick up as being engineers.
Yes, engineering students work extraordinarily hard, and when you get into industry, especially if you're in a startup, you have to work extraordinarily hard. So just having that work ethic and that mentality that everything it's 24/7. You're constantly thinking about the projects you're working on. Even when you're sleeping, you're dreaming about them. So it's 24/7.
So how did you find your employees? You talked to us a little bit about it, when the students were talking to you. How did you get the talent that you needed? How did you identify the right people?
It's critical. That's a great question, because when you're starting a company, money is precious. You don't have a lot of money, so you can't waste it on anything. You can't hire one person that's not the right person. Everybody has to be really appropriate for the task that they're doing. So fortunately, we had a nice network built up. Being a professor here, I was full-time from 85 to 95. Even though the company was founded in 91, I was still full. Our first office after we moved out of Nick's garage was in one of the high-rises on Wilshire and Westwood. So we stayed close to the campus so I could still be a professor here. I still had students to manage the master's and Ph.D. dissertations. I was still teaching full-time. So Henry Nicholas was there full-time, and then I was able to hire some of my Ph.D. students to come work part-time at the company as well. And so I had a network of students there. So and once they graduated, we hired them in full-time. So we had a built-in pool of labor at the university that we could draw from, who are perfectly trained because they were doing Ph.D. dissertations and master's theses on exactly the topic we needed, because people in industry really weren't trained in this area. It was a new area other than the defense industry, and that was the second place we went, We hired from Hughes Aircraft, from TRW, friends we had in industry. So having a base network of people that you can draw from, that you trust, and know what their skills are, that they fit the needs that you have. So we never placed a want ad in the newspaper or anything. You hire people you know, and then when you bring them in, they hire people that they know, and it just builds on itself. So you have a reliable source of talent.
Yeah, that's roughly how we do our professor hiring too. A lot of it is people we know and the network. I mean, the ads don't necessarily get you
right.
anything.
And that's one of the downsides of starting a company fresh out as a student. When you get your degree and then you go and say, I want to start a company. Okay, that's ambitious, but you don't have that network built up yet. It's critical to know who to draw from when you're out there in industry. So I was extraordinarily fortunate that I had the industrial experience from TRW plus the academic experience from here at UCLA. So I had a very strong network to draw from, which is not easy. It took 10 years here and 15 years of experience before I had the background to start the company.
Yeah. Well, we're going to run out of time pretty soon, so I'm going to turn to Broadcom and Avago. Now, Broadcom was acquired by Avago in 2015 for an eye-popping $37 billion. So that tells you what the trajectory has been since 1991. And interestingly, the merged company is called Broadcom Inc. You shared with us.
Broadcom Limited.
Yeah, Broadcom Limited. Yes, indeed. You were called Broadcom Inc. and then
Broadcom Corporation
and then
Broadcom Limited. Yeah.
Tell us how you pull that off. I mean, why Broadcom Limited?
Yeah. Well, Broadcom had created a very good brand over its 25 years of existence prior to the acquisition. We were well known in the industry, and our customers knew us well. We had a great reputation that we could really design state-of-the-art technology. Where, interestingly enough, Avago also has a very long history, but they went through several name changes which destroyed their brand. Because Avago, if you trace back in history, they came out of Hewlett-Packard. They were the Hewlett-Packard Semiconductor Division. Then Hewlett-Packard decided they didn't want that division internally, so they spun it out as a separate company along with their instruments, and they spun out Agilent. And Agilent then had a semiconductor division. And then eventually they decided they didn't want the semiconductor division, so they spun it out again, and then it became Avago Technologies. So it went through two name changes. So the name Avago didn't have the long history, even though it came from a great heritage. It lost the brand value. So Broadcom actually had a better brand than Avago. But also, when they came to acquire us, Henry Nicholas and I, when we founded the company, we created what were known as super voting shares. We got 10 votes for each share that we owned, versus everybody else who owned the shares publicly had 1 vote per share. So we actually controlled the fate of the company and could veto an acquisition if we didn't like it. So that gave us a lot of bargaining power. So when Avago came to us, I requested politely that we keep the name Broadcom. And they recognized first that the brand had a lot of value, but also the fact that we had a lot of bargaining leverage with the control we had over the company. So they agreed and decided to keep the name, which in retrospect, I think they are happy they did. It's a really good name and it served the company well.
So what led you to agree to the merger? I mean, why did you even pursue it?
No, I mean, we could have continued on as a standalone company, but it was an interesting opportunity because we looked at the heritage of Avago, where they came from, the technology they had, very complementary to the technology that Broadcom had developed over the years. They were roughly the same size in terms of revenue. So the merger essentially doubled the size of the company. And they were very well managed financially, and it was a good offer. They made us a nice offer of a premium above what we were trading at publicly, and we just said for the future of the company and in the best interest of the shareholders, it was the right thing to do. And I was able to continue on as CTO. I was able to maintain a board seat, which I still have today. So my role didn't change that much. So it just fit well and was amenable to it. So we agreed, and it's turned out to be a tremendous decision because the company has just taken off from the point we were acquired. It's only been 2 years, but we've literally doubled the stock price in that time frame since we were acquired. So the company is now worth twice as much as it was worth when we were acquired. So it's definitely the right thing to do.
Now, company mergers are not easy. Cultures are different. I've seen a lot of mergers that don't go all that well. It sounds like that's not been a problem, or
it hasn't. And you're right. I say most large company mergers don't go well because you have a clash of cultures and things just go south. This hasn't been the case with Broadcom. It's been really quite remarkable. And I think a lot of it has to do with the leadership. The CEO of Avago, Hock Tan, is quite a remarkable individual. Brilliant person. He's a MIT educated engineer, has a Harvard MBA. Really just a smart, well-rounded guy, and very savvy on how to run a company. And he's instilled a really powerful culture, and he delivers the goods. I mean, he delivers the financial results. Broadcom Limited is one of the most profitable semiconductor companies in the world, and the employees are extremely well compensated, much more so than they were at Broadcom Corporation, because he's generating so much profit, and he's giving a good chunk of that back to the employees through stock and bonuses. So it's just a very good environment, and it's a rare example of how large mergers can work, but it takes a strong leader to do that, and Hock is a very, very strong CEO.
So technologically, where do you see the company going? What's the future of broadband communications? What are y'all investing in?
Sure.
Where are we headed?
I mean, it evolves steadily. The whole field of broadband, from the day we founded Broadcom, going from voice band modems to our first generation cable modem, which was running at 30 megabits per second. And it just keeps evolving. Higher speeds, make the chips smaller, lower power. Today you can get cable modems for broadband internet access that run at over gigabits per second to your house, and virtually everybody has cable modem connections to the internet these days. And then we also expanded beyond cable into other markets. Wireless is a huge opportunity for us that we expanded into, largely out of the research that was also done here at UCLA under Professor Abidi. We collaborated, four faculty, Professor Abidi, myself, Professor Patti, Professor Ramatsamy, who did the antenna work, and Professor Patti on the communication system side, myself on digital signal processing, and Professor Abidi on the analog and RF circuits, to build complete broadband communications transceivers in chips. Extremely successful research project. It was funded by DARPA, and that ultimately led to the founding of Broadcom. But if you look at it it's just a matter of making chips faster, smaller, cheaper. That's what the world of semiconductors is all about, in Moore's law scaling. And that's what we have been doing for the last 25 years, and it's going to continue on into the future. Your cell phones get faster every year. The Wi-Fi, the cellular connections are pushing gigabit speeds now. Your internet access to the home pushing gigabit speeds. Network infrastructure is much faster than that because everything gets aggregated into the core network. So those speeds are hundreds, literally hundreds of gigabits per second of switching and routing and transport over fiber networks that happens in the network infrastructure, which is another area that Broadcom has major business in. So we play in virtually every segment of the broadband communications market, whether it's wired or wireless, and whether it's on the consumer end product in the cell phone or in the network infrastructure in the switches and routers. I mean, we make the claim that virtually every packet that's sent over the internet, as you mentioned in the introduction, passes through a Broadcom chip somewhere in the network. So that's essentially the future of the company. We just keep evolving the network to make the infrastructure chips faster, cheaper, lower power, make the handset chips faster, cheaper, lower power, and no end in sight. It just keeps evolving as new applications appear. Now, with machine learning and artificial intelligence, companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, they're all throwing billions of dollars to expand the network infrastructure so that they can build faster and faster computer networks to process all these images that are dumped into the network by all of you on your cell phones, so that they can tell you that a dog is in that picture. So it takes a lot of computing power, a lot of processing that has to occur, and a lot of network communication that has to occur. So you guys are creating the demand, but then that creates more interesting product opportunities for companies like Broadcom.
I want to pull away a little bit from the technology talk, because we've got just about maybe 7 or 8 minutes left. Now, you've been a great supporter of our school. You serve on the Dean's Executive Board, and you've given us a lot of good advice over the years. Where would you like to see our school going? What do you see as challenges? What do you see as opportunities?
Well, I think we've got some great opportunities in front of us. I mean, UCLA is one of the premier public universities in the world, and UCLA Engineering is also one of the premier public engineering schools in the world. And in many ratings, it's number one. In many ratings, it's not. So, everybody's got opinions of how good schools are. There's lots of ratings out there. But the point is, you want to create a world-class university to really compete with the privates. I mean, it's nice to separate out a category and say you're a public and you're the top of publics, but you want to also be a top university, whether public or private, but leverage the advantage you have as a public university, where the tuition is much cheaper. You have much more access to lower income students and provide much more financial aid than the privates typically do. So I think that's really what it's all about, is expanding the access, because that's really what a public university really can do. So I think your focus on diversity and promoting more women in engineering and underrepresented minorities in engineering is something I'm very excited about personally, and our foundation is very supportive of those activities. But just generally growing the stature and reputation of the school, even beyond what it is now, which is already great. And that's through recruiting great faculty. Built a lot of new buildings here. We're in one now, so we have more space to be able to recruit new faculty. Chancellor Block has allocated 50 new faculty positions to add to the school. So recruiting some of the world's top researchers will then attract the world's best students and create the world's best research results, and hopefully great companies that spin out of that. So it feeds on itself. It's a whole ecosystem. But it's exciting. I think the opportunities for the future of the school are really significant.
Oh, I'm absolutely excited and absolutely thrilled by the support that you've given us. I want to speak a little bit about your own philanthropy. What is the philosophy that guides your philanthropy? What do you invest in? Why do you do it?
Well, Susan and I started our foundation right when Broadcom went public. Because overnight, we became very wealthy. And so we knew that we wanted to give back. I mean, it probably comes from our culture growing up. We came from a very modest background and worked very hard when we were young. And so we want to promote the opportunities for those that don't have the wealth to be able to succeed in life. So to create opportunities for the underserved, create opportunities for those that are less fortunate, as well as invest in excellence as well. So we do both. But STEM education is probably the top of the list of the things that we invest in our foundation from day one. Of course, endowing the schools here at UCLA and at UC Irvine. But we've continued to make those investments. We'll continue to make more investments in the future. So to me, it's a lifelong passion, and we will continue to support the school, but also K through 12 to create the opportunities for the younger kids to come into universities like UCLA, who are less available or have less opportunity, but we can create those opportunities for them. Another major area of our philanthropy is in health, in particular integrative health or complementary alternative practices. That's something that Susan has been passionate about for 30 years. So we've invested heavily there. and we'll continue to do that. Other areas of interest in our foundation, and these all come out of our passions. People ask us all the time, how do you decide what to give money to, because you get infinite requests, which we do. There's not enough money on the planet to satisfy all the requests you get from charities. So you have to decide where you're going to put your money, and you typically do it where you're passionate and what is meaningful to you as a person. And for Susan and I both, STEM education is at the top of the list, but then integrative health for Susan, and then serving youth, foster youth, underserved youth, giving them opportunities. Another major area of our giving. We created a high school in Orange County. This is called the Samueli Academy, that serves foster youth and underserved youth in Santa Ana and provides opportunities for them through hands-on engineering-based learning. So it's a very engineering-oriented curriculum, and these kids are flourishing. They're doing so well in these maker labs. It's really exciting to see. And then sports is another interesting one, because owning the Anaheim Ducks, so youth sports, in particular youth hockey, we promote lots of youth hockey. We build ice rinks in Orange County and provide free learn to skate programs for the young kids, the underserved kids, even disabled kids. It's fascinating when you can get disabled kids on the ice, how much fun they have. So just creating a community around the Ducks is fun for us, because you want the whole community to be involved. So starting with kids, 3, 4, 5 years old, we get them on skates and so forth. So those are the major areas. And then the last one I forgot to mention is Jewish philanthropy. Given our backgrounds, given my parents living through the Holocaust, so that's an area that we feel strongly about, and we support Jewish causes both here in our community and Israel as well. So those are the major legs of philanthropy in our foundation, but all driven through passions of Susan and myself.
Well, we've got just about a minute left, so I want to close this out with asking you what advice you have for our students here. I mean,
well, I guess first of all, becoming successful is not just about creating this grand plan and knowing now what you're going to be doing 10 years from now. There's no way you're going to know. Life takes left turns, right turns that you have no clue about. As I said before, I never planned on the success of Broadcom. I thought I was going to be a TRW for my career until the UCLA opportunity presented itself. Then I thought I was going to be a professor for my entire career until the Broadcom opportunity presents itself. Things get presented to you as opportunities, and you need to take advantage of them. And that's part of risk-taking. You've got to take risks and be willing to take advantage of opportunities that present themselves. But there's no way you're going to know 10 years in advance of what you're going to end up doing. So focus on your education. Do something you like, because, again, if you're not happy with it, you're never going to put in the hours that it takes to be successful. Entrepreneurs or working in companies, if you want to be successful, you have to work extraordinarily hard, and you only do that if you love what you do. So find something you're passionate about that you love, invest the effort, get your education, and when opportunities present themselves, take advantage of them. Take risks. It's okay, especially when you're young, to try something. If it fails, try something else. But don't try to plan too far ahead, because your life is going to take left turns and right turns that you had never thought about. So stay relatively near-term focused, set near-term goals, and go after them with everything you've got, because a lot of competition out there. Everybody's trying to do the same thing. So it takes a lot of hard work and takes a lot of IQ points, and hopefully you'll be successful at it. But even if you're not wildly successful, that doesn't matter. If you're trained as an engineer, you're very likely going to be successful in life, because the skills you get as an engineer apply to just about any profession that you have. Logical thinking, as we talked about, creative thinking, innovation. So my guess is you get a degree in engineering, you will be successful in life, and that's really all that matters.
Well, we've got plenty of IQ points, and we've got plenty of hard work, so I know this crowd's going to do really well.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop here and maybe take some questions. Yeah.
Raise your hand, and then they'll bring the microphone around. You're shy. Somebody raise your hand. Come on.
Yeah.
Once the first question comes up, then they'll flow in. There's
Oh,
one right.
come on, Greg.
Greg, all right.
So Henry, besides Broadcom, there was earlier pair gain,
Yes.
which is how we met at a standards meeting.
Yes.
So they weren't exactly just modem speeds. They were a bit higher. So why didn't you consider them to be competition, besides the fact that you were working for the company?
Because I didn't divert into that story because it would take me off to the left field. But while I was a professor at UCLA, I was asked to consult for a startup that had been started out of the founders came out of TRW, who I had known and worked with them while I was at TRW. They started a company called PairGain to do technology was called DSL, Digital Subscriber Line Technology. And they built the end products. They also did a chip for the product, but they built the end product. That was their business. And so I consulted for them. I was still full-time at UCLA and consulted 1 day a week for them and helped them develop their products and also helped them to do a chip for that product with Henry Nicholas. Henry Nicholas also joined them and ran their chip group. Now, so the question is, and that was actually my first exposure to what a startup even was. But the question is, why wouldn't they become a company like Broadcom? In fact, when we decided to commercialize some of the technology that we were developing at UCLA, we actually considered doing it through PairGain. And we approached the CEO at the time and said, we've got these great ideas of other products to do it in broadband communications. Do you want to do them through PairGain? And he said no. And it was the right answer, actually. When you're a startup, you better maintain focus, because if you get too diversified and defocused, you'll fail. Guaranteed you're going to fail. A startup cannot be successful unless it's hyper-focused on building a successful product. And trying to do 10 products is a disaster. So he said, no, we're not interested. It's interesting stuff. Probably will be successful, but we just can't defocus what we're doing here at PairGain. And that's why we ended up doing it separately and starting Broadcom. So it's an interesting turn of events. I didn't have time to get into that whole story, but now that you asked the question, I did. All right. Good question. Thanks. There was one right here.
I was wondering if you could comment on Broadcom's recent decision to move back a lot of business operations back to the U.S.
Sure.
Following this merger. I know that a lot of the operations in the headquarters in Irvine were moved offshore. Do you see that as like strength in U.S. technology in the future, or was this more like a financial move?
Well, Broadcom was founded as a California corporation originally, and as we grew, we hired people from all over the world. We acquired companies from all over the world. So we ended up being a global enterprise, even though our headquarters was in Irvine and most of our employees were in California, either Southern or Northern California. We did have presence in Europe and Asia, all over the place, Israel. So we were a global company. But Avago, when it was spun out of Agilent, they decided to incorporate in Singapore for tax reasons. Singapore offered them much lower tax rates. Even though most of the employees, much like Broadcom, were in the US and California, they chose to incorporate in Singapore for tax reasons. And that's where they were. So when they acquired Broadcom, we, by default, became a Singapore corporation because we became whatever the parent company was, and Avago was in Singapore. So became a Singapore incorporated corporation. But the operations didn't move overseas, even though they were incorporated in Singapore. There were still, the bulk of the employees, 2/3 of the employees are still in the US, even today, with Avago. But they, again, for financial tax reasons, they were incorporated in Singapore. But recently, with the new tax bill that was passed by Congress, corporate taxes have been substantially lowered, and it became attractive for us to consider coming back to the US because acquiring companies as a foreign entity, acquiring a U.S. company is actually challenging. You need to get government approval, and it becomes difficult. So we decided if we're going to continue acquiring companies and expanding in the U.S., it was better to be a U.S. company. Even though the tax rate for us went up and will go up from what it was in Singapore, it still is less than what it would have been had we been under the old tax regime. So we're willing to accept the increase in taxes, but because of the new tax laws, it was still attractive enough to come back to the U.S. So that's the reason we did. So we are in the process of now re-domiciling the company as a U.S. company.
Okay. Recently, in the news, I read that Broadcom is looking to acquire Qualcomm, which is another big company that's very similar. So, what do you hope to gain, or at least Broadcom hope to gain from acquiring Qualcomm?
Well, Broadcom has grown a lot through acquisitions over the years. Even when we were before Avago, Broadcom Corporation, I think over our history, acquired, I think, 60 companies, literally. Most of them very small startups. And that's how we grew. We hired lots of people to expand, but acquiring a company is a much more rapid way to expand, because if a company already has a technology that's proven, it's in the market, they're making revenue, by buying them, boom, you're instantly in that market, rather than try to develop that on your own and compete. It'd take you 5 years to try to compete with a company that already has an existing product. So acquiring technology was a good way to grow, and Broadcom Corporation in the old days did that quite a lot and allowed us to grow from double every year, as I talked about earlier. Our revenue doubled every year, both from organic products that we developed on our own, plus from acquiring other companies that had products that we could sell as well. Well, Avago did the same thing as a standalone company. When they spun out, they started acquiring companies too to grow, and ultimately even acquired Broadcom, which was almost a merger of equals because they were about the same size. So it's a way to grow your revenue quickly, rather than if you try to invest in a new technology. As I said, it takes years and years before it's mature enough to become successful in the marketplace, and it may not even be successful because you have established competitors. So buying a successful competitor brings you in to have the revenue right away. So lots of companies are doing that, are consolidating and acquiring one another. It happens in all maturing industries. When an industry starts out, you get lots of startups, and then they grow, and then eventually when the industry starts maturing, the companies start consolidating and merging with one another. So that's just more along the same path that Broadcom Corporation used to do, and Avago Technologies did as well, and continues to do, to acquire companies to grow revenue and become a more powerful company in the industry. So that's the motivation. Oh, here, go ahead.
Hi, I'm actually a PhD student at UCLA in the computer science department. So I'm more used to the research kind of stuff. I was wondering, when you move from a purely academic position, doing research all day, to a startup where you have to deal with all kinds of different tasks in a completely different environment, what was the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge as a startup, I think the biggest challenge, interestingly enough, is marketing credibility. You're trying to, here's a startup developing chips for broadband, and you've got 20, 30 engineers, and that's it. And you're trying to sell a chip to a large corporation that's trying to deploy millions of cable modems in the world. And why would they trust that this tiny little company that was just founded a few years ago could deliver millions of chips reliably into their product and be successful? It's extraordinarily challenging to do that. In fact, I'm still shocked today that they did do it and trust us, because they literally bet their company on our chips, because if the chips failed, they'd be in serious problems. And so large companies don't like to bet their future on a startup unless they have to. They had no choice, and that was the case. There was no alternative. We had chips that nobody else had. They either bought our chips or they had no product. So that's how we did it. But trying to gain credibility in the early days to look larger than life, and that's where presentation skills come to play, where you can present your technology in a way that makes it look very credible and mature and robust. Not easy. So you have to become a salesman as well as an engineer. And maybe lecturing in front of students helps refine your sales skills. I don't know. But so I became a very good salesman over the years. And I think that was some of the biggest challenges to grow a company, is to be able to convince your customer base that you were a credible, reliable source and able to mass produce these chips for the consumer market.
So I interned at Northrop Grumman this past year, and I think a lot of students, or like peers my age nowadays, are kind of steering away from the defense route. You said you started off at TRW. Sorry, Mr. Sugar. Don't want to insult. But I just wanted to know if you had any comments or maybe carefully worded advice on students whether or not we should be looking at like startups or the Googles and Amazons of the world, or still looking at defense. And I just think it's like a very different situation than when you guys were coming out of college.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of advantages for working for a large company when you get out of school. Maybe not for your whole career, maybe for 5 years or something, and then if you want to do a startup, great. But I think jumping right into a startup, maybe not the best thing to do, because again, you want to get some exposure to what it is to build real products and markets, and what does the marketing department do, what does the sales department do, what does engineering do, how do you manufacture in volume. And these are things you learn at large companies that you don't necessarily get at a startup. So I tell you, the 5 years I spent at TRW were probably the best 5 years of my career in terms of the knowledge. I was a sponge that just absorbed knowledge left and right. So it's incredibly valuable to work. It doesn't necessarily have to be defense. It could be a large commercial company too. But working at a large company, and the advantage of defense, you get lots of fun, exciting, diverse projects to work on that are state-of-the-art, pushing the limits of technology that you might not see in the commercial world. But that being said, there are advantages to working for larger companies for a portion of your career, if not your whole career, but certainly a portion of your career. So I wouldn't count it out. I think, especially right out of school, that has a lot of advantages.
Hi. I kind of wanted to step away from talking about the companies and more on what your passion was, which one of them is STEM education. Especially since you've transitioned from being a student to a professor to working in industry, and you and both the dean have talked about your experiences and what's inspired you to be engineers. And also you said that early on, many people weren't engineers. It was not such a popular thing. And now we have many people in the engineering field. So one of the things I'm curious about is how you've seen the engineer develop and how you've seen that type of persona, and if that change has actually influenced how we're being educated, and if you are looking at that in terms of how you promote education in schools in engineering.
Yes. Oh, that's a great question, because as I said, when I was a student, engineering wasn't an exciting field to enter because there weren't very many job opportunities, so kind of frowned upon. My parents would have been much happier if I became a doctor or a lawyer, quite frankly. They didn't even know what an engineer was. But as you know, in the last 20 plus years, the engineering profession and computer science profession have become much more glamorous. I mean, the Bill Gates of the world and the Elon Musk of the world, they've made it a much more glamorous profession, and it excites students much more to pursue careers in STEM education. So I think it's turned much more positive than it's ever been before, and it's continuing to grow in popularity, and I think it's important. And it's not necessarily because you need to pursue a STEM career. I think getting an undergraduate degree in engineering and becoming a lawyer is a great thing too, because I think the best lawyers out there probably have engineering degrees. The best doctors out there probably would have engineering degrees. Engineers make great professionals because, as I said before, the unique problem-solving skills that you acquire, the innovation that you have, apply it to any field. I don't care. But get that training in STEM as an undergraduate, and it will almost guarantee your success. And the fact that it is now becoming a much more glamorous industry where you're seeing huge successes. All the biggest, most successful companies now are tech companies. So that's exciting to see. So I think it's changed the field dramatically, and it's starting to transition, and it's been a slow transition to create more diversity, because when I was a student, you'd have 1 or 2 girls in a class if you were lucky. I mean, the diversity in undergraduate education when I was a student was horrible. So we're now starting to see much more diversity in the classroom, which is great. I want to see a 50-50 split between male and female in engineering over time. It was 15% when I was a student. So, but you want the diversity in the school to match the diversity in the population at large, because that creates the opportunities for everybody. So I think that's another area of focus for STEM education and philanthropy, is to promote more women in engineering and underrepresented minorities in engineering, because the opportunities are enormous. And I think, for me, that is one of the most exciting directions to head in.
So I had a question. Is there a story behind why you bought the Anaheim Ducks?
That's a good question. It was really opportunistic. I was not a huge hockey fan. And when I grew up, especially going to UCLA in the 70s, I was a huge basketball fan, played myself, and just loved basketball. But Disney ended, as it turned out, created the Ducks, the Mighty Ducks, and owned the team for many years. But eventually Disney decided that they weren't in the sports business and they should divest themselves of the Angels and the Ducks, which they own both teams. So they put both teams on the market. So it was an opportunity that presented itself to me. It seemed exciting, owning a professional sports franchise. Seemed like a great thing for the community to keep it locally owned here. Even though I wasn't a huge hockey fan prior to it, I have since become a gigantic hockey fan. By far my favorite sport. I think it's the best sport to watch live more than any other sport. So I'm a junkie for hockey now. But at the time I wasn't. It was really just an opportunistic thing that fell in my lap. Again, as I said before, your life takes left turns and right turns. Opportunities present themselves. And it's whether or not you take advantage of those opportunities that define your life. So this was an opportunity that presented itself. I took advantage of it. And it's not like I was looking to buy a sports team. I wasn't. The day before, I had no clue. It's just when the opportunity fell in my lap, I pursued it and ended up taking advantage of it. And I'm glad I did. I love it.
We have time for 2 more questions. Take advantage of the opportunity.
Henry, I'm curious. You and Susan share your affections with UCI. Is there a story behind that?
Sure. Interestingly enough, it ties back into UCLA. So we moved the company down to Irvine in 1995. And why? I mean, we were in a high-rise office building here in Westwood, which is fine when you have 10, 20, 30 people. But when you want to scale the company, you can't be in a high-rise office building. So we needed to move. We needed to find a place, a tech park, so to speak, where it would be good to grow the company. And it turned out we had a couple of engineers working for us at the time who were from Orange County. So they said, you guys got to come down and look at Orange County. A great place. They have this Irvine Spectrum they're building up, perfect for tech companies. So we went down, looked at the housing prices were cheaper, the commutes were less and less crowded, and the tech opportunity for tech parks were much greater there. So we decided to move the company to Orange County. So the tie to UC Irvine came about when UC Irvine School of Engineering was searching for a new dean. And they ended up hiring Nick Alexopoulos, who was a professor here and chairman of the electrical engineering department here, who I had worked as a colleague, and he was the chairman of the department. So I knew him extraordinarily well. So he accepted the job as dean of engineering at UC Irvine. So once he moved down, we maintained our relationship. He brought me into the school and got me acquainted with things. So once we decided to Susan and I make our gift to UCLA to name the school, he also made the proposal, why don't you do the same thing for UC Irvine? I got it at a discount, by the way. It cost $30 million to name this school, and only cost $20 million to name UC Irvine School of Engineering. So I couldn't turn down the discount.
Value for money, all right.
Yeah, right. So, so that's how the connection came about, through UCLA, through an alumnus of UCLA who became dean of UC Irvine School of Engineering. And it's all about relationships. Philanthropy is about relationships. You don't write multi-million-dollar checks to strangers. You know, you have to be comfortable with people. You have to have faith that they're going to do the right thing with the money. You have to have faith in the organization that they're going to be successful. So it's all about building the relationships with the leaders of those organizations, with the deans of the schools, with the chancellors of the schools. And that takes years of work. But that's how it came about.
One last
Hi, I'm a Ph.D. student at the Electrical Engineering Department. Entrepreneurship has always been difficult, especially for the hardware. I believe one of the most difficult part is bringing the academic prototype into MVP. And in this process, money is needed. I mean, not so much needed, but some is needed. And I've always been thinking that's a very difficult part. Have you ever thinking about helping some of the motivated entrepreneurs in electrical engineering department during this process? Thank you.
First, let me address the general issue you brought up. Yeah, it's definitely more expensive to start a hardware company than a software company. But the flip side of that, because it's so easy to start a software company, anybody can do it. So there's no barrier to competition. You just buy a computer and you can start a software company. So you have more competition in software than hardware, but it's more expensive to do hardware. But I think competition is more of a worry than money, because you can generally, if you have good ideas, you can often raise the money if the investors feel that there's really an opportunity there. So don't worry about the fact that it's more expensive. I think if you have a unique product and a unique hardware opportunity, you have a higher likelihood of success because the competition will be more difficult. Then the second part of the question, would I personally get involved in funding the entrepreneurs from electrical engineering? I made a conscious decision a few years ago to focus my energy more on philanthropy than startups. I did some startup work investing earlier on, but it became too time-consuming. Each startup, it takes a lot of effort to do the due diligence, to work with them. And once we started building our philanthropy, we just didn't have the time. I personally just didn't have the time. So today I do very little startup investing and spend most of my time either at Broadcom doing philanthropy or with the Ducks. So those are the three major areas of time consumption for me, which fill the day and night. In fact, after this, I'm headed off to the Honda Center. The Ducks are playing the Pittsburgh Penguins tonight, so I want to catch the end of that game. So I don't do a lot of startup investing for that reason. I just don't have the time, and I've chosen to prioritize philanthropy over startup investing. Not that, it's just a personal preference. It's not that one's better than the other. It's just you do what you're passionate about and what you enjoy. Not that I don't enjoy startups, but I enjoy philanthropy more.
Well, I'm afraid I've got to call this to a close. I know there's going to be a gazillion questions if we keep going.
And I'm
so
going to
we
have
do
to run out
stop.
very quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I do want to thank you, Henry. This has been truly wonderful. I mean, you know, the school's borne your name, and I've known about you before I came to UCLA, and I've had the chance to get to know you these last couple of years. This 1 hour has told me so much about you and about Broadcom and about your thinking, and it's been a truly wonderful experience.
Good.
Thank you so
I'm
much
glad.
for doing it.
Happy to be here. Thanks.